Hello, this is Sarah Braasch. Welcome back to my channel. So, Gretchen Mullen, Skeptic Review 89, she asked me to do a video about France, what's happening in France, and everything that I know from my experience living in France for a year, working as a human rights fellow with Ni Pute Ni Soumise, a really fierce women's rights organization comprised mostly of women from the banlieue, which are the predominantly Muslim immigrant ghettoized suburbs around the major cities of France. So anyway, I'm very familiar with France, with their constitution, their legal system, etc., their history. And so she thought, I did a video and a blog post about the Cuties movie that was on Netflix that everybody was in an uproar about. And I did that because I have, a lot of experience in those communities. I did a sociological study there where I went out there to some of the suburbs that were involved in the 2005 and 2007 riots, which were not dissimilar to what's happening in the U.S. now after Ahmaud Arbery, Jacob Blake, George Floyd's, killings. Or Jacob Blake didn't die, but I believe he is paralyzed now. And so similar type of thing happened in France in 2005 and 2007, and intermittently since then as well, where young Muslim immigrant, dark-skinned boys and young men died at the hands of the French police. And then there were protests and riots and cars being burned. But the thing that's interesting, so just so people understand, so what I'm going to be talking about is President Macron, his response to the recent beheadings by Muslim terrorists in France. And there's been a bunch of incidents recently. And so, of course, everyone is shocked and horrified. And so the French government, and Macron in particular, are really cracking down on any Muslim organizations in France that are deemed to be extremist. And recently, I guess a group that is known as the Grey Wolves is an ultranationalist Turkish group, and they have been closed down by the French government, by Macron. They defaced apparently some monument in public, a public monument to the Armenian genocide, and so Macron has acted to shut them down. They are illegal. They can no longer exist. So anyway, and so he's taken a very hardcore stance immediately after the first beheading, the first recent beheading that happened, which was the teacher who showed cartoons of Muhammad, and then someone found him and beheaded him. In response to that, so Macron took a very, very hard line and just said, this is, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no hemming and hawing and hand waving about this. We are a society that embodies the principles of the Enlightenment and civil liberties and civil libertarianism, and we have free speech in this country. And so he's less concerned about stigmatizing Muslim communities than he is about making sure that the girls and women in those communities have full and unfettered access to their French citizenship, including, their human rights and all of their individual freedoms and liberties. And so, he's no longer basically going to, be led around by the nose by the cultural relativists and the Islamists. Like, that's just, he basically just said it's just not acceptable here. This is France. and you will abide by the Republican values of the French Republic, you know, secularism, free speech, all the civil liberties that we claim to love and uphold in the US. And if you don't want to live by that, women's rights, that women's rights are human rights without compromise, and if you don't want to respect that and you don't want to live by that, then you can leave France. And that's basically what Macron said. And so everybody, of course, this was a huge deal, and everybody's in an uproar about this now. And is this the right tactic to take? Is this going to incite even more extremism? Is this going to incite even more violence, more terrorism? And so that's the question. So I wanted to talk just a bit about the history, so just so people understand the context. And I'm not claiming to be some kind of an expert, and I don't know everything that there is to know, but I know a lot, and I'm happy to share what I do know based on the experiences that I have had. And I actually really love the French Constitution. I love the French legal system. I love the Republican values of the French Republic, and Marianne with her breast hanging out. And anyway, so I love everything. I really love France. I have a deep love and respect for France. And I always have, and that's why I chose, after I got my JD at Fordham and I passed the bar, and I went straight to France, and I had a fellowship from my law school, and I worked there with Ni Pute Ni Soumise for a year, and I lived there. And I love France. I love the strict secularism of laïcité. I love their view of the public space. So we'll get to that. So I don't want this video to get too long. But anyway, so in the 70s and 80s, France needed a lot of labor. So they basically went to their North African colonies and said, come on in, come to France, everybody come in. So now, then the economy, subsided, went down, wasn't as robust. And so then, of course, who bore the brunt of the economy, being not so great, which were the Muslim African immigrants, new immigrants, who had come in the 70s and 80s when France really needed their labor. So then what happened is France basically corralled the Muslim immigrant communities out kind of in the middle of nowhere, in the suburbs. So in the US, we sort of think of the suburbs being like the nice place to live, and it's the opposite in France. If you're the elite, you're living in the city center. And if you're a new Muslim African immigrant, you're living out in the suburbs. And they built these enormous, behemoth, concrete structures that are all crumbling, these disgusting, projects basically, and they're basically the ghettos, right? So the suburbs are the ghettos, these ghettoized housing projects out in the suburbs. That's where the predominantly Muslim African immigrant communities live, okay? And they have really struggled, and they don't have easy access to education. They don't have easy access to jobs. They don't have easy access to transportation. It's hard for them even to get into the city center, even to go to a job interview, even to go to school, to make their lives better. These communities are very depressed economically. And then after the 2005 and 2007 riots, and then there is discrimination. There's racial discrimination in France. Don't get me wrong. And there's plenty of racial discrimination in France. And so these communities were very depressed. And so, of course, people turn to religion in that situation. And so the mosque becomes, the salvation for the community. And anyway, so in 2005 and 2007, there were riots in these communities, cars burning. When I went out there, And I had to take, like, to get out to these places, we went out to the suburbs where the riots took place in '05 and '07, and we saw that there were still burned out cars there. It was 2010 when I was there. And there were still burned out cars on the street, crumbling concrete, behemoth, disgusting housing projects. And the women that we spoke with would complain, the elevator never works, had to walk up 25 flights of stairs, etc. And so, but it was a very similar situation to what we're experiencing on the unrest we're experiencing now in the U.S. After George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Jacob Blake, etc. That's what they experienced in France and the suburbs in '05 and '07. It was young Muslim immigrant African immigrant men that died at the hands of the French police. And so it was a similar type situation. Now, since then, the French government did they did invest a lot of money in those communities. And so when I went out there and conducted this sociological study, I would have to take like a bus and a train and a bus to get out there. You know, it was almost impossible to get out there. But then also, like, the bus drivers would tell us that sometimes the bus drivers just refuse to work because it's so dangerous for them, especially at night. Because they get attacked if they drive the bus out in those communities. But anyway, so that's the situation, just so people understand. Now, I've already done videos about Ni Pute Ni Soumise, but just basically, they're a really fierce women's rights organization. It was in the early 2000s that they started as a response to the egregious violence perpetrated against the women and girls in these communities. There was a young girl who was burned alive, and she died. And she was burned alive behind a dumpster by an ex-boyfriend. And it's that sort of thing. So there was a march, a 40-day march across France, so anyway, that is Ni Pute Ni Soumise, and they are comprised mostly of women from these communities: Muslim, African immigrant women, first, second, third generation, grew up in these communities out in the suburbs of the major cities of France, these very depressed, discriminated against communities. So it's not like there aren't legitimate grievances by these communities, right? For sure there are. Absolutely there are. But what I loved about Ni Pute Ni Soumise and the three pillars of their movement were gender equality, gender desegregation, and laïcité, or the strict French version of secularism. So that's why I loved them. So Ni Pute Ni Soumise, their position was women's rights are human rights. There's no compromise. We don't care. We reject Islamism, which is political Islam, but most of us are Muslim. We embrace our religion. We embrace our community. We will march with you against racial discrimination, but we do not accept violence against women and girls, and we do not accept that women are second-class citizens with lesser human rights. Women's rights are universal human rights. There's no compromise. Nothing is up for negotiation. We reject cultural relativism. We reject obscurantism. And, women are full French citizens. They should have full access to the public space, full access to their citizenship, free speech, etc., full equality for women. And they advocated for fully desegregated by gender public spaces, and so they supported the burqa ban. So this was a group of mostly Muslim women's rights activists who did consider themselves to be Muslim, absolutely, and they supported the burqa ban. It was colloquially known as the burqa ban. There aren't I don't think probably almost any, I think there's basically no one in France who's wearing a burqa. They would be wearing a niqab, would be the face covering, just below the eyes. But anyway, so that is the situation. And then what you want to probably understand about France too is that their version of secularism, laïcité, is different from the U.S. version. I think we need to adopt the French version in the U.S. And they also have a different view of the public space. And there's growing difference between the French and the U.S. view because of the ridiculous view of the Democrats and the woke political left of the public space. I'm just going to adjust here because my hand was starting to shake a little bit. So anyway, so laïcité in France, it's basically it's usually considered like a strict or a hardcore version of secularism. And so they actually really like that's why they have, and this is coupled with their view of the public space. So they view access to the public space, free and unfettered access to the public space, as part and parcel of your French citizenship, okay? And so that is part of your citizenship rights, is having full and free and unfettered access to the public space. Like any kind of segregation of the public space is just completely illegal, and they just construe it as being just completely unacceptable because you are constraining someone's citizenship rights. And so that's completely unacceptable. Any segregation is completely unacceptable. And so that was one of the pillars of the Ni Put Ni Soumise movement, was gender desegregation. And it's speaking specifically to the public space. And so this is why this group of Muslim women who adhered to the principles of the French Republic very strongly, they actually supported the burqa ban, because the burqa ban is actually seen as a civil rights measure. It's seen as a civil rights measure because it's seen as a public desegregation measure, a gender desegregation measure. And I actually support civil rights legislation in the U.S. And some people might initially not expect that, but I do. And the reason why is the same way that the French view it. They view civil rights legislation as basically as desegregation measures. And I think we should adopt more of a view of the public space like the French view, and see our civil rights legislation as public desegregation measures. That's how I view them. And so that's why the burqa ban was really seen as a civil rights measure, And so that's important to understand. And so now I think that the U.S. view really should be of secularism, really should adopt the French version, a really sort of strict, hardcore version, where it's just, religion basically just has no place in government speech. In the U.S., what we have is more that just more, although I think it's not constitutional. Obviously I agree with the French view of secularism. So I think it's just a constitutional violation when this happens. But in the U.S., there is we have you can have congressional prayer, and it's seen as it's not actually taking a step towards having a state religion. So there are varying viewpoints in the U.S., and obviously I'm one of them, and mine would be an extreme, we should adopt the hardcore secularism of France, but other people say, oh no, it has to be a step towards establishing a state religion is what is considered, unconstitutional. But some people who take a more relaxed view in the US towards what secularism entails and demands would say something like, oh, congressional prayer is fine. It's not taking a step towards establishing a state religion because we have Buddhists pray, we have Christians pray, Catholics, Jews can pray. We have different people, giving the prayers. So it's not just Christian, etc., etc. And also they say things like, the Supreme Court jurisprudence on this are things like, oh, well, it's just to solemnize the legislative event. It's not to coerce people into being religious and adopting the tenets of a particular religious faith, etc. So there's a much more obviously relaxed view towards the role that religion can play in government and in the public space, in the US, and by many persons, obviously. In France, that is a no-go. No, there's no role. There's no role that religion can play in the government at all. And remember, because of the view that they take of this public space, that the public space is government space. The public space is government space. Your access to the public space is part and parcel of your French citizenship. And I actually think that obviously I already said it. I love France. I love the way the French, view both the public space and secularism and the role that religion can play in government and in the public space. But the reason why, and so a lot of people in the US just won't understand it, and they'll think, well, what about free speech? Like, someone should be able to express their religious views in the public space, right? And so, yes, of course, they can just express their religious views in the public space in France, but they can't curtail anyone else's expression, right? No segregation, right? And so there's always a problem, like something that's been a problem, for a while now in France, is that there'll be a group of Muslims that will take over a street and they'll pray outside. And especially they'll do this as a form of activism, like if they're having difficulty getting a mosque built. And so they'll all pray outside in the street and take over the street. And then not usually, pretty much always, the women have to pray in the back. This is segregating the public space. This is segregating the public space, not just by religion, but by gender. And this is completely unacceptable, on the French view. So that sort of thing. And this same reasoning for why they wanted the burqa ban. It's seen as a desegregation measure. You cannot segregate the public space. You cannot restrict someone's access to the public space. Okay, because that is, that's restricting their access to their citizenship. And that is unacceptable on the French view. Completely unacceptable. So anyway, this is just getting really long, this video, and I have more that I would love to say and talk about this, but I think I've said a lot. So hopefully this was helpful, just to help people understand what's happening in France, why Macron is taking such a hard line and against, these Muslim groups in France, and the French view of the public space, the French view of the role of religion, that there is none. There's no role for religion. They're strictly secular. There's no role for religion, in government, in French government. And so, anyway, and then also sort of the history and the situation of these predominantly Muslim immigrant communities in the suburbs, and the really still ongoing egregious violations women's, human rights in the suburbs as well. And so all of this has now, come to a head, and the French government, and specifically Macron, are really, putting their foot down. So anyway, that's what's happening. I'll do more videos about this. This video got a little long, a little too long. I like to keep my videos 10 to 15 minutes at most. This one's about 25, but I hope that was helpful to help people understand what's going on in France. And I'll do more videos. And I'll ask people for questions on Twitter too, if there's any specific questions people have. Okay, great. And I will talk to you all later. I'll have my PayPal me and GoFundMe links below. Please donate to my legal fund so that I can sue Yale and the fake news press and the moral outrage industry and everybody. I love you all so much. Have a great night. Bye.